I never thought I would be the kind of woman who strayed. Marriage had always been a sacred promise to me, something unshakable, something meant to last. I had spent years believing that love, true love, was a force that could weather any storm, endure any hardship. I told myself that as long as I was faithful, as long as I did everything right, my marriage would stand strong. And yet here I was, staring at my own reflection in the dim glow of the bathroom mirror, feeling like a stranger in my own skin. Mark and I had been together for nearly a decade. We had built a life together, a quiet and predictable existence filled with shared routines, knowing glances, and the unspoken understanding that comes with time. I used to find comfort in that familiarity, the way he set his coffee cup down on the kitchen counter in the exact same spot every morning, the way he absently reached for my hand in his sleep. But lately, I had begun to wonder if familiarity had simply become another word for stagnation. I loved Mark. I had never doubted that. He was a good man, kind, patient, steady. The kind of man who never forgot to ask how my day was, who always made sure the gas tank was full when he knew I had a long drive ahead of me. He was dependable in a way that made me feel safe, like no matter what happened in the world outside, I could always count on him to be there, to be the same. But somewhere along the way something had shifted within me. It wasn't a sudden realization, nor was it a single moment that marked the change. It was gradual, creeping in like the slow fade of autumn into winter. I found myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if love was supposed to feel like this, like a well-worn sweater, comfortable but no longer exciting. I told myself that passion was for the early years, that love matured into something quieter, something deeper. And yet I couldn't shake the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, I had mistaken contentment for happiness. It was in those quiet moments of doubt that the first cracks began to form. Cracks that I did not yet fully understand, but cracks nonetheless. I did not know then where they would lead, nor did I yet realize that I was standing at the edge of something I could never take back. All I knew was that something inside me was beginning to stir, and for the first time in years, I was afraid of what that might mean. The change was so subtle at first that I barely noticed it. It wasn't that my life suddenly veered off course. It was more like a quiet undercurrent, shifting just beneath the surface. It began at work. I had always kept a respectful distance from my colleagues, maintaining a professional barrier that never invited personal entanglements. But Daniel had a way of slipping through that unseen wall, of making conversation feel effortless rather than obligatory. He was the kind of person who could turn a dull meeting into something engaging, who could make the mundane seem meaningful. I wasn't drawn to him in the way stories often describe. No stolen glances across the office, no lingering touches or whispered words. It was simpler than that, almost imperceptible at first. A shared joke here, an easy conversation there. It was his attentiveness, the way he listened with genuine interest, that caught me off guard. He asked questions that no one else did, and he paid attention to the answers. I told myself it was nothing. That I was simply enjoying the presence of someone who saw me as more than just a wife, more than just a predictable fixture in his life. But the more we talked, the more I realized how much of myself I had let fade into the background over the years. With Daniel, I wasn't just Mark's wife or the dependable woman who always had dinner on the table by 7. I was a person with thoughts and dreams of my own, and I had nearly forgotten what that felt like. It was harmless, I reasoned. Just a friendship. But deep down I knew better. I had begun to seek him out, not in any overt way, but in the way my eyes instinctively searched for him when I entered a room, the way my heart lifted just slightly when I heard his voice. I told myself that as long as I kept it within these boundaries, it wasn't wrong. But boundaries, once blurred, have a way of disappearing entirely. And in my heart, I knew I was already beginning to cross a line I could never uncross. The days turned into weeks, and what once felt harmless became something I could no longer ignore. Daniel had slipped into my life like a whisper, and now he was everywhere, woven into the quiet moments between my thoughts, lingering in the pauses between my words. At first I convinced myself it was just friendship. After all, what was the harm in having someone to talk to, someone who made me laugh in a way I hadn't in years? But then there were the stolen moments, those seemingly insignificant interactions that held more weight than they should have. A brush of his hand against mine as he passed me a document. The way his gaze lingered a second too long during a conversation. The unspoken understanding between us, growing stronger with each day. I started leaving the house earlier in the mornings, knowing I might catch a few moments with him before the rest of the office arrived. Lunch breaks stretched longer than they should have, though neither of us acknowledged why. When I came home in the evenings, I told Mark about my day the same way I always had, but there was a part of it I left out. A part of my mind that was still lingering elsewhere. Mark noticed the changes in small ways. "You've been distracted lately," he said one night, his voice casual but his eyes searching mine. I forced a smile, brushing a hand over his. "Just work," I told him. A lie so easy, so effortless, it frightened me. But it wasn't just work. It was Daniel. It was the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in so long. With Mark there was certainty, stability, a life I could count on. But with Daniel there was something else. Something I didn't dare name. I told myself I wouldn't let it go further. That I would keep control. But deep down I knew I was already losing it. The moment it happened I knew there was no turning back. It wasn't planned. I hadn't woken up that morning intending to betray everything I had built, everything I had sworn to protect. And yet, by the time the sun had set, I was no longer the woman I had been when the day began. I told myself I wouldn't let it go that far. That I was stronger than temptation, that my marriage was unshakable. But temptation isn't a force that arrives all at once. It's a slow, creeping thing, weaving its way into the fabric of your life until you can no longer tell where it began. And when the moment came, when I found myself alone with Daniel, when his touch sent shivers through me in a way I hadn't felt in years, I didn't pull away. I should have. I should have thought of Mark, of our life, of the promises we had made. I should have left, turned away before the line between right and wrong blurred beyond recognition. But I didn't. I told myself that just once wouldn't change everything. That one moment, one stolen night, didn't mean I loved Mark any less. That I could still go home, still be the same woman I had always been. But as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling with Mark sleeping peacefully beside me, I knew the truth. Everything had changed, and I could never take it back. The days that followed were a blur of tangled emotions. I floated through them, caught between the weight of my betrayal and the intoxicating memory of Daniel. My body remained in my home, my hands still folded the laundry, still stirred the pasta sauce, still reached out absently for Mark in the quiet moments before sleep. But my mind was elsewhere. Adrift in the space between two men, two lives, two versions of myself I no longer knew how to reconcile. Mark hadn't noticed. Or if he had, he chose not to say anything. He still kissed my cheek before heading to work, still asked about my day with the same gentle concern as always. But I felt the distance now more than ever. It wasn't just guilt that made me withdraw. It was the realization that I had already been drifting long before Daniel came into the picture. The love Mark and I had built was still there, strong and steady, but something vital had faded. Something I wasn't sure could be rekindled. And then there was Daniel. He was a storm, unpredictable, exhilarating, and entirely consuming. When I was with him, I felt like a different woman. He awakened parts of me I thought had disappeared, reminded me of a version of myself I had long buried beneath years of quiet compromise. But what kind of life could I truly have with him? Was he a fleeting escape, or was he something more? Could I bear the destruction I would leave in my wake if I chose him? The questions haunted me, chasing me through each moment of my day. I found myself standing at the kitchen sink one evening, staring at the reflection of my life in the window before me. The quiet hum of the dishwasher, the faint scent of Mark's aftershave lingering in the air. These were the things that had once made me feel safe. Now they only suffocated me. A part of me wanted to confess, to lay bare the truth and let the chips fall where they may. But I knew there was no way to do so without breaking Mark completely. He trusted me. He loved me. And I had betrayed him in a way I could never undo. Could I live with that? Could I let him continue loving me, knowing that my heart was no longer fully his? And if I walked away from Daniel, would I regret it for the rest of my life? That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the choice before me. It was an impossible decision. One that neither path could promise happiness. Because no matter what I chose, someone would be left in ruins. And perhaps the person most broken of all would be me. Days turned into weeks, yet no clarity came. I felt like I was standing at a crossroads, frozen, unable to take a step in either direction. Every moment with Mark was a reminder of the life we had built together, of the quiet, steadfast love that had carried us through years of routine and comfort. And yet, every thought of Daniel sent a tremor through me. A longing, a hunger for something that felt more like living than simply existing. I had avoided seeing Daniel outside of work. afraid that any further interaction would only deepen my confusion. But avoidance did little to silence the ache in my chest, the pull I felt toward him even when he wasn't near. The unspoken words between us hung in the air, thick with possibility, with temptation. And the longer I tried to resist, the harder it became. One evening, as Mark sat beside me on the couch, scrolling through his phone while the television murmured in the background, I felt the suffocating weight of my indecision. He glanced up at me, smiling in that familiar, effortless way, and I felt my heart clench. He didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve the lie I was living. "You okay?" he asked, his voice warm, filled with the same concern he had always had for me. I nodded too quickly, looking away before my eyes could betray the truth. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I couldn't exist in this limbo, pretending that my heart wasn't divided, pretending that I could keep holding on to both men without consequence. A choice had to be made. And yet, every option felt like a loss. That night, I found myself driving aimlessly, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and white as my thoughts spiraled. I ended up parked outside Daniel's apartment, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't know what I had intended, if I wanted answers or if I just wanted to lose myself in him one last time before making a final decision. But I never got out of the car. I sat there staring up at the dark windows, my heart pounding against my ribs. The weight of what I had done, what I was still doing, crashed into me. No matter who I chose, I had already betrayed something sacred. Myself, my vows, my past, my future, none of it would remain untouched. Tears welled in my eyes as I realized the truth. There was no right answer. There was no simple path forward. Whether I stayed or left, whether I clung to security or leapt into passion, I would always wonder about the path not taken. And so, as I turned the key in the ignition and drove away from Daniel's apartment, I still did not know where I belonged. Because perhaps I no longer belonged anywhere.